Welcome back to our Substance Use Prevention Fundamental Series offered by ADAPT in partnership with the National Prevention Science Coalition. I'm Laura Pipard. I'm the Director of ADAPT and the Deputy Director for Treatment and Prevention at the Washington-Baltimore HIDA, and Dr. Diana Fishbein is the Director of the National Prevention Science Coalition and has helped us in securing speakers for the technical webinar series. I wanted to just remind everyone of the purpose of this technical webinar series because I think it's important to reiterate what you're about to experience with this particular technical webinar again. The purpose of the series really is to break down these concepts that have been generated through technical assistance that we've been delivering to HIDA communities across the nation over the last year. So breaking down these concepts into relatable, and when I say relatable, I mean familiar in language, familiar in experience, breaking them down into relatable and digestible pieces. So as we tease apart the concept, the pieces are right size and you're able to consume them and hopefully apply them pretty immediately. So that's the purpose. And so what we've done as a translator of these resources, and I think that's important too to reiterate that ADAPT really wants to serve as a translator of some of these concepts, but also, and maybe even more importantly in some ways, once we've translated some of this stuff, connect you to existing resources already out there related to the concepts. And the way that we're doing that is through delivering a resource supplement with the webinars. So at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you will find an Event Resources tab. If you click on that, you will find something called a resources supplement for this particular webinar. And so within that supplement, you're going to find the slides for Dr. Lachos for today's webinar, and you'll be able to go ahead and download those and you can write on them if that's your style, right? So they're available to you now. But you're also going to find resources that are recommended by Dr. Lachos for evaluation, as well as additional evaluation resources that have been recommended by our ADAPT team and some of the work that we've been providing. And there are a lot out there. So use today as a starting point to breaking down those concepts again into relatable and digestible pieces, and then moving forward with additional resources. I did just want to highlight that the #1 technical assistance request that comes in from our HIDA communities is for evaluation. And that's interesting because it's not exactly the easiest thing to start with. And you saw in Dr. Lachos' webinar 3 weeks ago now that program planning is extremely important in order to set you up for success with your evaluation. And it is a skill set that some may devote an entire career towards. So he's going to break it down for you today, but I also want you to recognize that additional resources more than likely might be warranted moving forward for this concept. The other thing I wanted to share with you that I think is really neat and just simply a hotspot announcement for today's webinar is that ADAPT as a division has recently concluded a 10-week resilience campaign. And when we think about substance use prevention fundamentals, one thing that immediately comes to mind is resilience. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. It's a great protective factor that really can be used as a wonderful tool in individuals as well as organizations and communities. So it's something that can be built within all of those things. And so what we have done is packaged up the entire resilience campaign for organizations to disseminate in a way that makes sense for them. And we also will offer support in adapting that language for the population that they might want to target that might be different than the general population we targeted. So if you are interested in signing up to get that package or that portfolio of the resilience campaign materials, then please download the resource supplement and you will find information on ADAPT and how to connect with ADAPT and subscribe to some of our offerings. We'll be sending out this announcement within the next week. So it's hot off the press and you are hearing about it first. So please reach out to us if you'd be interested in crafting something like that for your particular community that you serve, because we'd be happy to support you in that. And finally, I would like to thank Patty Versazides for putting together this entire webinar series and coordinating the speakers. Of course, I want to thank Dr. Robert Lachos for joining us again. He held a phenomenal webinar a few weeks ago on program planning. This is a natural sequel to that. And I also want to thank Dr. Diana Fishbein, the director of the National Prevention Science Coalition, for supporting this effort and partnering with us on that. I'm going to hand it over to you, Patty.
Thank you, Laura. So before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few items so that you can maximally benefit from today's event and know exactly how to participate. So for your benefit, we've taken a screenshot of an example of the audience interface, and you just see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop. So we just want to draw your attention to two areas on your screen. First, you're going to have the opportunity to submit text questions to Dr. Lachose today by typing your questions into that Ask a Question pane that's located directly beneath the presenter image. You can send in these questions at any time during the presentation. We're going to have a few pauses throughout the presentation to discuss those questions that are coming through, and then again at the end. Also, as Laura mentioned, beneath the Ask a Question pane is where you will find the event resources section. That's where you can hit that drop-down arrow and access the event resources for today's event. Remember that a link to today's recording is going to be made available on the ADAPT YouTube channel, and it will also be made available via email distribution to anybody who registered for this event. Once this webinar ends, you will receive a post-presentation survey that will naturally sort of appear and pop up on your screen, and we really appreciate your time in completing that and providing your feedback. Once that survey is completed, it will automatically trigger an email to you with a link to download a certificate of participation for today's event. Lastly, just keep in mind that today you're in listening only mode, so that there was no option for dial in, just using listening through your computer speakers. For technical support during today's webinar, we have two contact information for you available on this slide. Go to webcast, or you can email us at our ADAPT email, and we will try to help support you. So now I'd like to switch gears and introduce Dr. Robert Lachose. Dr. Robert Lachose is a professor of public health at California Baptist University. He teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses in health behavior, research methods, statistics, and program evaluation. His research areas fall in the areas of alcohol and drug prevention, teen pregnancy prevention, adolescent development, and parent-child relationships. His research has been widely funded by the United States Department of Health and Human Services, the NIH, and the CDC. His research has also been published in premier journals such as the Journal of Adolescent Health, American Journal of Public Health, Health Promotion Practice, and the Journal of Immigrant Health. Currently, Dr. Lachose directs the Prevention Research and Program Evaluation Lab at CBU, where he has a SAMHSA Drug-Free Communities grant that focuses on decreasing opioid deaths through a first responder naloxone training program, as well as countering pro-marijuana influences to reduce youth access in Southern California. Dr. Lachose is on the board of directors for the National Prevention Science Coalition, the board of directors for the American Public Health Association, and serves as a faculty mentor for the Diverse Institute's Drug Abuse Research Training Program for NIDA. He earned his PhD in psychology from Claremont Graduate University, and as we just heard, he is incredibly well qualified and prepared in delivering this training. We're very grateful to have Dr. Lachose with us here today.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar on getting to outcomes and how we can use program evaluation to make sure that we're reaching the goals and objectives that we have for our programs. And what we're going to try to do today is give you a gentle introduction into the world of program evaluation, including identifying 3 reasons why we should be evaluating our programs. We'll also take a look at the different types of evaluations that we can conduct and how that might relate to things that you may be used to be doing, like program reporting or quality checks. We'll also take a look at something called implementation fidelity and discuss the importance of implementation fidelity in not only getting to outcomes, but also its role that it has in program evaluation. We'll take a look at how implementation fidelity can affect outcomes, both positively and negatively. And we'll look at the 6 common features of implementation fidelity, particularly those that might relate to different types of drug prevention and intervention programs. And we'll leave you with a couple of ways that you can immediately take this information and apply it to the types of programs that you are working on. So one of the common questions that I often get from those that are working in drug prevention, drug interdiction, drug intervention is, how do I get to outcomes? So for example, how do I reduce marijuana availability in my community? Or how can I reduce recidivism? Or perhaps how can we prevent adolescents from using drugs in the first place? And when we look at programs that are implemented, social programs, educational programs, juvenile justice type programs, it doesn't matter the type of program that we're implementing. They have 4 common features. And the common features to successful programs that get to outcomes is that they are planned well, they're implemented well, they're evaluated well. And when we do good program planning, implementation, and evaluation, we can get information to improve our program, to disseminate our program, to sustain our program, or even implement the program in another area. Now, when it comes to program planning, these include things like conducting a quality needs assessment to determine what intervention activities are needed in your community. We also have to think about what are the evidence-based interventions and why those particular interventions work with that priority population. This also might include developing a logic model, an illustration of how your program activities will lead to some type of outcome. And then, of course, we have to implement those programs. We have to implement those programs as they've been prescribed. If we do make adaptations or deletions to the program, how is that going to affect whether or not we're going to reach our goal? And then the most important part that can lead to program improvement is conducting an evaluation of the program, what we call program evaluation. We're going to find that evaluation is simply nothing more than judging the merit, significance, worth, or effectiveness of your program. And if you do program evaluation well, you're going to have the type of information that will allow you to make programmatic decisions to improve the effectiveness of your program. What I'd like to do now is have you participate in our first poll. And in this first poll, we're going to ask the question, is your program effective?
All right, everyone should see the first polling question on the screen. Please select your appropriate response and click submit. All right, everyone has responded, and it looks like we have 80.9%, 81% stating that yes, it is, and 18% stating that no, it is not effective.
And when I typically ask this question, we will get similar response rates. The majority of people believe that their program is effective. So one of the questions that I always like to ask folks when they say my program is effective is, how do you know? How do you know your program's effective? What are the standards that you're using to make that judgment? What are the criteria that you're making for that judgment? Are they your own criteria, or are they criteria that have been developed by your staff and other stakeholders? And I think this is important to understand in any conversation about program evaluation, because people have different ideas of what program evaluation is or isn't. I would also like to point out and recognize that the term program evaluation typically sends shivers down program staff's spines. And the main reason why is because many of us don't have a lot of formal training in conducting program evaluation, and the consequences of conducting program evaluation can be monumental. They can have positive consequences or negative consequences. So it's important for us to recognize that doing program evaluation, although a very important part of that program planning, implementation, and evaluation cycle, is not necessarily something that comes natural to most folks. So when we want to understand whether or not our programs are working, a good place to start is simply by answering the question, what is program evaluation? There are many different definitions of the term program evaluation, but a common definition is a systematic way of determining the value, the effectiveness, the importance, the significance, or the quality of some program or activity using credible evidence and standards. Now, we make evaluations informally every day in our normal life. One car is better than a different car. This product is better than this product. Whether I should wear a jacket or maybe wear shorts, depending on the weather. We make many informal judgments or evaluations every day. The type of evaluation that I'm talking about here is a little bit different. The type of evaluation that we do in program evaluation is using a system, and that system is going to have rigor. We're going to have standards, and we're going to have criteria in which we're going to examine. And I think the most important part of doing program evaluation well is that you have credible evidence to support your evaluation conclusion. So if you make that statement, my program is effective, you're going to have evidence, and that evidence is going to be credible evidence that will support that evaluation judgment or conclusion. Now, sometimes people confuse research with evaluation. So I wanted to take a moment just to highlight the distinction between research and evaluation. Oftentimes in research, we want to discover some new truth, or perhaps we want to look at the relationship between different types of variables. And when we collect data and we analyze the data in a research study, we're able to draw some conclusion based on a statistical analysis or some other way that we've come to some conclusion. And we say, this is a fact. This is something that's true. So for example, we might be able to show in a research study that when parents are involved in their kids' lives, those kids, when they're teenagers, are significantly less likely to use alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. But evaluation is a little bit different. In evaluation, we're going to use those research method skills. We're going to use our skills in statistical analysis, our skills in engaging people, our skills in writing and communicating things. But the difference between evaluation and research is in evaluation, you're making a judgment. You see, in research, we're not making a judgment when we say, when parents are involved in their kids' lives, those teenagers are less likely to use alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. We're not saying that's a good or a bad thing. We're just saying that is the relationship between parenting and adolescent drug use. In evaluation, we're making a judgment. We're saying this program is effective or this program is not effective. We're saying these are the ways the program needs to improve to get to outcomes. So there's a little bit of a difference here. I will also highlight that in research, usually the researcher is the one that's coming up with the research question and perhaps even the hypotheses. But in evaluation, the evaluator does not come up with the evaluation questions. Those evaluation questions often come from program staff. It might come from other stakeholders, like funders or policymakers. It could also come from downstream stakeholders, like the participants of the program or collaborative partners. So although research and evaluation use common tools, the purposes of each type of activity is much different. Another thing that I wanted to point out, that oftentimes what we think might be program evaluation isn't really what I'm going to be talking about today. So having a comment box and having people write comments is not program evaluation. Simply looking at trends over time, let's say in the use of different types of drugs, is not program evaluation. And reporting the number of services that were delivered by a program or satisfaction with a particular activity is not program evaluation. When we're talking about program evaluation, we're talking about judging the effectiveness or quality of a program, intervention, or activities to either give staff and other stakeholders information they need to improve the program, or to give upstream or downstream stakeholders information that they may need to make decisions about funding the program, implementing the program in a different area, or expanding that program. One common question that we often get from program staff as well as funders of programs is, why should we be evaluating our programs? Well, one reason why we should be evaluating our programs is because what gets measured gets done. If you don't measure it, it did not happen. And so if we can show how many services we delivered, what impact those services had on a community, and what information we're using to improve what we're doing, we're going to be more likely to get funded. Another reason why we should evaluate our program is because if we don't measure our results, the outcomes of what we're doing in our programs, we won't be able to tell success from failure. We'll have no way to make that distinction between, are we being successful or are we not being successful? And I think if you can't see that you're being successful, you can't reward it. So if we can't make a determination about which types of programs work and for whom, and which types of programs don't work, there's no way we can make decisions about funding, about staff, about what direction different programs need to go in. There's no way to make a decision about what types of programs or approaches are even needed in that particular community. If we're not rewarding success, then we're probably rewarding failure. And we see this often in social programs, where programs, despite the fact that they're not effective, continue to be implemented. And as civical workers and public workers that are using tax money, we're accountable to use that money in a responsible way. And if we can't reward success, then we're probably rewarding failure. If we can't see success, then there's no way that we're going to be able to learn from it. So if we can't see what successful programs look like, how they're implemented, what outcomes they're able to obtain, there's no way that we can learn from other people's approaches. And if we can't recognize that we're not being effective, if we can't recognize failure, then there's no possible way that we can correct it. And if we can't demonstrate results, there's no way that we're going to be able to win public support. There's a lot of scrutiny over social programs, particularly those programs where we can't immediately see the outcomes of our activities, because sometimes those outcomes may not be something that are widely known or even visible. It's very difficult to see whether or not a teenager is more resilient because they went through your program. That's not something we can see visibly. That may only shake out when we see reductions in drug use later on, when that person is an older teenager or an adult. And then finally, if you don't have good information in which you can make programmatic and policy decisions, then you're probably using bad information. And bad information leads to bad outcomes. And the type of work that we do in drug prevention and intervention matters. The quality of that work that we do matters in terms of increasing the health and well-being of those that are in our community. What might be some common reasons that people don't evaluate their programs? One reason why people don't evaluate their programs is something I call the do-gooder fallacy. The do-gooder fallacy is the tendency to believe that our programs are working, that our programs are effective, because we're busy doing good. We're busy doing the work that we do every day, working with members of our community, bringing partners together in our community to work towards a common goal. We're doing trainings, we're implementing our program. We may even be out in the field doing the program. And because we're busy doing the program, we get this logical fallacy, this error in our thinking that we must be effective. An example that I used last time is each summer, there's typically a kid that knocks on my door, and I'll get up from the dinner table, walk to the front door, I'll open the door, and there'll be a kid there, and he'll say, "Hi, my name's Eric. And if you buy peanut brittle, a jigsaw puzzle, or some gummy bears, you can keep me off drugs and out of gangs." So, because I'm a generous person, I reach into my wallet, I take out a $5 bill, and I give Eric $5 for some gummy bears that I know that I'm never going to eat. And when I walk back to my family at the dining room table, there's a smile on my face and a sense of pride I have in my heart because I've just kept Eric off of drugs and out of gangs. But isn't it as equally as likely that Eric could be taking that $5 bill down to the local convenience store and buying cigarettes, marijuana, or some alcohol? Those two things are as equally as likely, but we don't think about that because that would make us feel bad. Psychologists call this dissonance. So if we're at work and we are training folks and we are implementing programs and we're talking about our programs, and if we were to think about the fact that these programs are probably working, that would make our work days very, very long and make us feel very bad about ourselves. So what ends up happening is we get this logical fallacy, this error in our thinking that because we're busy doing good, that it must be having the outcome that we want. And that's simply not always the case. The one thing you have to understand about most social programs, particularly alcohol, tobacco, and other drug programs, is that the majority of our programs and approaches are ineffective. They simply don't work. Another reason why we tend not to evaluate our programs is because of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency for us to place our attention on things we already agree with, and we ignore things that we don't agree with. So oftentimes we'll be more likely to be engaged, place our attention on things that confirm the idea that what we're doing is effective. So for example, if we're looking at data that we might be getting from our local law enforcement agency that says the number of arrests for DUI are down in our community, and we're doing a DUI prevention program in the high schools, we're going to say to ourselves, oh my gosh, DUI arrests have gone down and we're doing a DUI program. Therefore, our DUI program is working. But isn't it as equally likely the reason why DUIs are down is because there's some other program going on? Maybe the state troopers in your state are doing more checkpoints, DUI checkpoints. And that's the reason why DUI arrests are going down. And it has nothing to do with your prevention program in the high schools. More often than not, it's something that we may not even be thinking about. Not only are we not placing our attention on it, we may not even realize that may be going on. Let me give you an example. I was evaluating a DUI prevention program in the state of Wyoming. They were increasing the number of presentations they were doing in high schools regarding the dangers of driving under the influence. And at the end of the year, they showed that there was a 30% reduction in the number of DUI arrests when you compared it to the previous year. What we found out, however, the most likely reason why there was a decrease in DUIs is because there had been memos sent out and training sent out to law enforcement agencies that had to do with new evaluation procedures and training procedures for evaluating law enforcement officers. So what law enforcement officers were actually doing were decreasing the number of times that they would pull somebody over for DUI, or perhaps they were doing fewer checkpoints, or perhaps they were arresting fewer people. And what we found was that the decrease in DUI rates had to do more with whether or not the law enforcement officers were doing their job in terms of enforcing DUI laws than it ever had to do with the prevention programs that were going on in the schools. But when you're busy doing a program, you're going to place your attention naturally on things that you already agree with and ignore those things that you don't agree with. Another reason why we fail to evaluate our programs is maybe because we have a belief that if the program just helps one person, then it's valuable. And so if we were to go to, let's say, Congress and say, well, thank you for the $3 million that you allow us to have to do our programs, and we only helped one person, I doubt that argument would hold water. But at the same time, we have to think about the fact that if it just helps one person, what we're really talking about is some type of anecdote that we've been effective. But what you have to understand is that just because you have one story or one example of where your program's effective, that anecdote doesn't equal evidence. Because you may be ignoring the other 999,000 people where that program had no effect whatever. Moreover, it could be the case that your program has some negative side effect. So it may have helped one person, but harmed other people. Another reason we fail to evaluate our programs is because we believe that program evaluation can often divert resources, time, money, staff, the amount of stress we're willing to put up with from the actual program or from the participants. With rare exceptions, some program participants are going to show some improvement in what they're doing. And some people believe that if we take time, money, other resources away from doing the program, and we place those towards doing the program evaluation, that may mean we might have to deliver less services. And so when we think about the idea that evaluation could divert resources away from programs and therefore could harm participants, I see this as a common concern and a valid concern that staff may have. But I think we need to address the fact that evaluation can help determine what does and what does not work in a program. And it can actually help improve the program and make it more likely that you can reach those program participants and be effective. But without doing the evaluation, there's little or no evidence that what you're doing is working. I often like to think that doing program evaluation is just a part of doing business. For example, if you're a car company like the Ford Motor Corporation, you're going to test to see whether or not your brakes work, because the consequences of not ensuring that the brakes work on a motor vehicle can be disastrous. So they look at evaluation, in this case, evaluating whether or not the brakes work in a car, as just a normal part of doing business. Finally, many people fail to evaluate programs because of the fear of disappointing results. They view the idea that evaluation's only going to uncover those things that are bad about the program. And while most of our social, educational, and justice programs are not effective, there are a handful that are effective. We know some things about some programs. And every program has positive aspects of it, and every program has negative aspects of it. And becoming a learning culture where you're implementing programs, evaluating programs, and then using that evaluation information to make improvements of the program is very, very important. Let's now take a look at what occurs in what I call the program evaluation cycle. So if I'm performing an evaluation for some staff, an agency, a client, this is what it typically will look like. The first thing that you want to do when you're conducting an evaluation is describe the program or intervention. You want to describe the program or intervention as it's been planned. So describe the program as it's told to you from the program staff. What do they believe that are the core components? What is the theory of that program or model of that program? What are the components of the program that are difficult to implement compared to the ones that are more easy to implement? You just want to get a description of the program as the staff see it. But you also want to get a description of the program as it's actually being implemented, because those two things might be different. How the program is supposed to be implemented may be very, very different from how it's actually implemented. So you're going to want to be able to get a description of the program from staff, but also a description of the program as it's implemented in real time. We want to develop evaluation questions. What is the information need that staff have? What are the information needs that policymakers have or other stakeholders in the community have? These information needs may be born out of necessity to improve the program or to make a judgment about the program or use information to expand or get further funding for a program. Once we have the evaluation questions, then the evaluator should gather credible evidence. What types of evidence or information is going to be needed to answer those evaluation questions? Once we have that evidence, then we can analyze and interpret that data. And then once we've done our data analysis, we can report and use those results. When we're thinking about describing the program, it's important to have a logic model that specifies what the goal is, the behaviors that the program participants should demonstrate to reach that goal, the determinants of those behaviors, and then the program activities that are thought to influence those determinants. We also need to think about what is the short-term impact. So before that goal changes, what are the hypothesized impacts this program should achieve? One easy way to think about the purpose of the program is just simply answering the question, how is success going to be measured? How are we going to know we scored a touchdown? When it comes to developing evaluation questions, we might think about, well, was the program implemented as we planned? And if it wasn't implemented as planned, how was it implemented? And how did those changes affect whether or not there were short-term impacts or we reached our outcome? Did something change? So if we have an intervention to try to increase resiliency among youth, did those resiliency factors change? Did the program make an impact on some type of behavior or attitudes? Was the goal achieved? Did we decrease marijuana availability in our community? And most importantly, did the program that we're doing cause the outcome? So if marijuana decreased in your community, was it your program that caused that decrease or something else? In terms of gathering evidence, we need to think about the type of research designs we need to use to answer those evaluation questions. How are we going to get that data from our program participants or community members? And what are going to be the data collection tools we can use to collect that data? What survey instruments or assessments can we use to collect that data? Once we have that data, we need to perform the appropriate statistical analyses. Sometimes we may just want to describe the frequency of drug use among teenagers. Other times, we may want to look at which factors predict adolescent drug use. We may want to look at changes in alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use over time. We might create tables and figures or even dashboards where there can be some type of interaction that staff and community members can have with that data. Perhaps they can go to a dashboard on a website where they can say, I want to know what drug use is in this particular zip code among this age group or ethnic group or gender. And that information can be easily obtained through some dashboard. And one of the most important parts of this evaluation cycle that's often neglected is reporting and using the results. Oftentimes, evaluations go into a filing cabinet. People say, thank you for conducting the evaluation. We've got all this great numbers and everything. And then they don't use that information. And evaluation utilization has been something that many folks in the world of program evaluation have been studying, how to get stakeholders, how to get staff to use evaluation results. I think we need to think very carefully about the purpose of evaluation when we're describing the program and developing the evaluation questions. We also need to tailor the reports and presentations to different audiences. The type of presentation or report or the meeting I would have with stakeholders at the local level is going to be much different than the type of presentation or evaluation report that I might do for the state legislation or for a policymaker or for a funder. Most importantly, I think we should be using these evaluation results in our program planning. So we need to periodically stop and say, here's some new results we have about this activity, this intervention, this particular program. What modifications or changes do we need to make? Do we need to offer that program at a different day or time? Do we need to increase the dosage? Do we need to make some type of adaptation? Do we need to perhaps go after a different priority population? Or even maybe we just need to throw out our current approach or program and select a new program that may be appropriate. What I'd like to do now is stop for a moment and answer any questions that our participants might have today.
Thank you, Dr. Lachos. We have actually had a few comments as well as a couple of questions come in. So just to summarize the comments, people are appreciative of you breaking down these concepts the way you are. So thank you for that. We also have had a participant describe in many ways the sectors they're engaging with to develop some common goals, shared goals around evaluation and how they're doing that together as a community as opposed to just an organization. So I wanted to highlight that. The first question that's come in is, how many total evaluations and how many different types of evaluations? So evaluations that would be performed, say, by a program developer, from an external evaluator, from different roles, right? How many of these does a program need to actually show effectiveness? And at what point can you say, what's the threshold? What point can you say it's effective?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. You know, the question of how do you know you have an evidence-based intervention or an evidence-based approach? You know, does that take, one evaluation, 2 evaluations, 10 evaluations? My sense is that there are standards that we use and criteria that we use to designate a program effective or a promising program or even a best practice or a best approach. And those are kind of all different kind of tiers where, an evidence-based or an effective program would be at the top, and then maybe at the bottom might be an evidence-informed or a best practice that we might have. There are standardized criteria that we use in public health, criminal justice, education, certainly, even in prevention science. And that has more to do with how well the evaluation was conducted, not the number of evaluations. So the quality and the rigor of the evaluation, I think, matters more than the number of evaluations that are conducted. But what I will say is that sometimes what people will do is they will identify and select an evidence-based program. They will implement it and they will say, well, my evidence shows that it's effective, but they don't have credible evidence. The research design or evaluation design is poor. The instrumentation is not reliable or valid. The analytical techniques don't allow one to come to that conclusion. The sample size is either too small or too big. There's a number of ways that you can have a low quality evaluation. So you might have a situation where the evidence isn't just that strong. But also, I think what happens is people will do an evaluation of their program and they'll say, well, we've demonstrated outcomes. We have good evaluation information. The design was good. The analyses were good, so on and so forth. So we don't never need to evaluate that program again. But here's the rub. When you go week to week, month to month, year to year, we never are implementing the program the exact same way in the exact same moment of time with the exact same priority population. Those programs are constantly dynamic. And so conducting an evaluation as you're doing your program implementation and developing that cycle and that culture of learning where you're constantly examining the effectiveness of your program is very, very important. Going back real quickly to my metaphor on the Ford Motor Corporation making cars and checking the brakes. Can you imagine a world where the only time we ever checked the brakes was when Henry Ford made the first car, and then when we never checked the brakes on a car since then? I would imagine that every time a new car comes out of that factory, somebody is checking the quality of that car or the effectiveness of that car. Are there other questions?
Thank you, Dr. Lachos. There actually are 3 additional questions, but I'm only going to ask you one that has been sitting here for a while. And if we have time at your next pause, then I'll ask the other 2. This one is relevant to what you've just presented. The participant is actually a leader of evaluation within her organization, and she's suggesting that her evaluation, so if you have evaluations that contain poorly worded questions, she finds that they get more data about the quality of that evaluation than the actual program, what they were trying to measure the effectiveness of in the first place. What tools should be used to differentiate between programmatic results and results reflecting the quality of the evaluation? Ultimately, she asked, how am I not just trying to write an evaluation that games the audience to get the results that I want?
Well, remember, when we're doing evaluation, we're making a judgment based on some type of evidence. And if the evidence that we're getting to support that judgment is bad evidence because we don't have quality instrumentation, maybe that instrument that we're using, that survey, that questionnaire, isn't reliable. Maybe it's not valid. Maybe people can't comprehend it. Maybe there are other issues going on, like self-reporting bias or Hawthorne effect. There's a number of different things that can happen when we're collecting data. But if we don't have good instrumentation, then our measurement's going to be off. And if our measurement's going to be off, anything we do from there on is going to be off. So our analysis will be off. We're giving that information to staff and they're going to use that information, but that information isn't going to mean anything. Think about the fact that if you had some type of measuring tape or ruler that you created yourself and it said 12 inches on it, but wasn't exactly 12 inches. It was 13 inches or it was 10 inches. If a carpenter uses that ruler all the time, their house is going to fall down because the data collection tool that they're using to measure the length of wood or angles or whatever it is, it's going to be off. And so it's very, very important that we use quality data collection tools. And I could spend, a whole semester on that, and I do on data collection tools. But the best piece of advice that I can give staff is never ever create your own survey or data collection tool. Always use an existing data collection tool. Well, now what I'd like to do is talk about planning for an evaluation. So what are some things that have to occur before we even start doing the evaluation? I think it's important to understand that planning for the evaluation should start at the same time you're planning the program. So if you're writing a grant to fund some type of activity, you need to start thinking about how you're going to evaluate that while you are planning your program. The worst thing that can happen, and this happens at least once a year to me, is I'll get a phone call and somebody will say, we're in the year 2.5 of a 3-year-long grant, and our funder requires an evaluation. Can you evaluate our program? And at that point, it's a little too late to be able to do anything. It also tells me that program's probably not a learning organization if they're waiting to the end of their program to even think about evaluating it. It also is very likely that that's going to be what we call a pseudo-evaluation. So a pseudo-evaluation is where an evaluation is conducted simply so people can say they evaluated their program. If you're waiting 2.5 years into a 3-year-long program to evaluate it, you probably already believe that your program is effective and there's no need to be doing evaluation, and you're waiting to the last moment because you're being told that you have to evaluate the program. I think when we begin to think about an evaluation, there are 4 key components that I typically ask staff to think about. One is, who's going to be interested in the results of this evaluation? And why are they going to be interested in the results? Are they going to be interested in it because they want to improve their program? Maybe staff want to improve their program. Or maybe you have a policymaker that needs to make budgetary decisions about whether that program should be expanded, or maybe that program should be diminished. And then you need to think about what is to be evaluated. Are you going to evaluate the outcome, the behaviors, the processes? I also strongly encourage people to think about how those evaluation results are going to be used. And I think if you ask that question, how will these results be used while you're planning your program, the stakeholders will be more likely to use that evaluation information. So a good way to increase evaluation utilization is to have stakeholders delineate and plan on how they're going to use that evaluation information before the program and evaluation starts. One of the things that I often like to do is ask staff, well, what are you going to do if I tell you your program is effective? What are you going to do with that information? So if I tell you your program is effective in decreasing opioid overdoses in your community, what are you going to use that information for? At the same time, I'll ask them the question, if we find out in the evaluation that your program is not effective, that it has no impact, you're not reaching your outcome, what are you going to do with that information at that point? And then I also think it's important to come up with some type of statement that really explicably and concisely shows the purpose of the evaluation. Is the purpose of evaluation to improve the program? Is the purpose of the program to get information to get better PR? Is it to make budgetary decisions? Is it to provide evidence that we need to increase staff or we need to expand the program into other areas? Now, although we need to think about doing evaluation and planning for the evaluation early on in the program, it's important that we understand the 2 main types of evaluation. One type of an evaluation is called formative evaluation. And formative evaluation is typically conducted to give program staff information to help them improve the effectiveness of their program. So as an external evaluator, I can give staff information to say, well, perhaps you don't have enough participants coming at this particular after-school site, or there hasn't been a change in behaviors. And obviously, if there's not a change in behaviors, the logic model says the outcome will not be reached. So formative evaluation is evaluation conducted to give program staff or other stakeholders information on how that program should be improved. Sometimes I like to think about formative evaluation is when the chef tastes the soup. So Robert Stake, who started doing research on program evaluation itself, said that formative evaluation is when the chef tastes the soup. So when the chef is in the kitchen tasting that soup and they say, oh, I think it needs a little more basil, or it needs a little more salt, or maybe it needs to be thicker, they can improve the taste or the consistency of that soup before the customer ever tastes it. Now, another type of evaluation is summative evaluation. And summative evaluation is when the customer tastes the soup. Summative evaluations are conducted to make judgments about the effectiveness, quality, the merit, significance of that program. While formative evaluation will let us know whether or not the program is needed, being implemented well, or how to improve it, summative evaluation is going to have an overall judgment. The program is effective. The program's not effective. The program's not meeting the need of the priority population in the community. So formative evaluation is when the chef tastes the soup, and summative evaluation is when the customer tastes the soup. You see, the chef has no opportunity to improve the taste or consistency of that soup once it's served to the customer. But the customer is going to make a judgment of whether or not that soup tastes good, it's too hot, it's too cold, it's worth the price that was paid. And there's nothing can be done in order to improve that soup once the customer has it. Another thing I think it's important to think about when you're planning for the evaluation is who should evaluate the program. And you could have an internal evaluator, so somebody who is on staff at your program or has a stake in that particular program. It might even be somebody that is not necessarily involved in your program, but works for the same organization that your program is housed in. Or you could have an external evaluator, somebody who's not a staff person. They don't have a stake in the program. They're not related or have an affiliation to that agency or organization. And there are advantages and disadvantages of both approaches. An advantage of an internal evaluator is that because they are involved or employed by that organization and may be involved in implementing that program, they're going to be more familiar with the program, its core components, its activities, its logic model, its theory, than perhaps an external evaluator. A disadvantage of using an internal evaluator is they may not be trained in doing evaluation, research, or statistics. They simply may not have the competency or the experience to do those types of tasks. An advantage of an internal evaluator is it's typically lower cost. You already have them on staff. You're already paying their salary. They already have a desk. The lights are already paid for, so on and so forth. A disadvantage of an internal evaluator is that if you have a staff person working on the evaluation, that may mean that time is going to be taken away from other tasks that they may need to do, like implementing the program or working on partnerships or writing grants or writing reports. A disadvantage of having an internal evaluator is that oftentimes, because that person is employed by the program, they're employed by that agency, they don't have the ability to impact the organizational or cultural change that's occurring in that organization. So turning that organization or even program into a learning culture that can be data-driven is going to be difficult to do for a staff person. A huge advantage of having an external evaluator is that you can increase objectivity. They're not familiar with that program. They may be familiar with those types of programs, but maybe not your specific program. But what I found as doing external evaluation is that it's more important to have somebody that is trained in doing evaluation. They're good at research methods and statistics and surveys and reporting. They don't have to be an expert in your particular field. In fact, one of the best evaluations that I ever did was an evaluation of a mammography prevention program for African-American women above the age of 65. I've never had a mammogram. I'm not African-American and I'm not 65, but it turned out to be one of the better evaluations that I ever conducted. I also think having an external evaluator brings much more credibility to your evaluation, because an internal evaluator is inherently going to be biased, whether they're conscious of that bias or not. Even if no bias occurs, because you had an internal evaluator about the program, there's going to be some type of subjective bias. People are just going to think that bias occurred. A disadvantage with an external evaluator is you're going to have to set aside funds for that. You're going to have to set aside resources in your budget to pay for that external evaluator. I think a benefit of an external evaluator is that they can be solely focused on improving your program and giving you the information that you need to make decisions about that program. I also think that depending on the evaluation approach, and there are a number of evaluation approaches, a good evaluator in some evaluation approaches will help the staff themselves to do some evaluation activities and help build the competency of that staff so that they can transform their organization into a data-driven learning culture. That being said, regardless of whether or not you have an internal or an external evaluator, they need to have formal training, not only in research, but particularly in evaluation methods. There are very few academic university and college programs that provide training specifically in evaluation methods. But I think it's very important because there's a lot of people that can come and do a research study of your program, but they're not going to be able to do an evaluation. Another thing I think is important for us to consider is how much should you devote to conducting that evaluation. And in general, what we see is that you should set aside about 10 to 20% of your program's budget for program evaluation, whether it's internal or an external evaluation. Now, if you have a program where you have a $3 million budget, the amount that you set aside may be 9 or 10% because there are fixed costs. For example, electricity costs a certain amount, whether or not you have a budget that's $100 or you have a budget that's $100 million. But if you have a program where your budget is maybe $300,000, because there are fixed costs, that may mean that you have to set aside 20% towards evaluation. There are some ways, particularly as an external evaluator, that I can reduce costs by having some of those evaluation activities done by perhaps students at a local university, if they're trained, or obviously empowering staff to do some of those evaluation activities. But I think I would encourage people to think about the resources, time, money, space that they would put towards evaluation as just a normal cost of doing business if they want to be effective. What I'd like to do now is pause for a moment and we'll do another poll and kind of look at what concerns you all may have about evaluating your program.
All right, the survey has just been sent out to you all. This is an open text survey, so if you wouldn't mind taking a few moments to type in your responses and then press submit when you are done.
Dr. Lachose, do you mind if I squeeze in a quick question while we're waiting?
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful idea.
Okay, it's a question directly relevant to the material you just presented. We had one participant just ask, is it necessary in your opinion, based on that 10 to 20% measurement that you just presented, to hire a full-time evaluator or epidemiologist, or even a part-time evaluator, or is a consultant okay on an as-needed basis? What do you suggest?
I think it's a really good question. I think if you want to have an internal evaluator, you need to hire somebody with training in evaluation. And most people that are epidemiologists are simply not going to have that training. They may have training in biostatistics and maybe even research methods, but they're probably not going to have training in program evaluation. I think the best thing you could do is hire an external consultant. I think that's going to be most valuable to staff. There's a lot of research that demonstrates that. I also think it's going to be the best use of a limited amount of resources. So I think hiring a consultant to evaluate a particular aspect of your program or a particular intervention, I think is good and is a lot more fiscally responsible. So for example, you're not going to have to pay for space for them. You're not going to have to pay for benefits for them. So in the long run, that can actually be cheaper. Now, if you have somebody on your staff that has training and experience in evaluation, or even your agency, it might be valuable to seek that person out. So if you're working at, let's say, a large public health department or maybe a state law enforcement agents, they may have a researcher or an evaluator in that department. They may just not know anything about your particular program, and you may be able to get them to help you on that program. But I do think getting an external evaluation consultant is the way to go.
So the survey responses are in, and just to briefly summarize, it looks like a number of concerns came up around costs and having the appropriate expertise or skills in doing the evaluation. There are also some concerns regarding the evaluation tools not being up to par, just getting actual participation and sort of authentic participation and responses from participants. Those were some of the key themes that continue to come up.
Yeah, and I think those are all kind of valid concerns that people have. And I think that's why it's important to really think carefully about evaluation and get help, because those people that are trained in evaluation know how to get reliable and valid information from folks. You know, a question that I often get when I teach the research methods classes, how do you know when you ask somebody, let's say, how often they take drugs, if they're telling you the truth, right? They may be telling you that they take drugs less than they actually do, or they may be telling you they take drugs more than they actually do. But there are ways that I've been trained to get reliable and valid information. Is it easy to do? It's not, but there are ways. I'd also say in terms of just data collection tools and instrumentation, you know, I strongly encourage folks to use existing data collection tools. Almost anything out there that you would want to measure, somebody's already taken the time, years, money to develop a reliable and valid data collection tool. A group that I was working with a couple of years ago wanted to measure the functioning of their collaborative, like how well are they functioning in terms of a group of agencies coming together. And they said, can you develop a tool? And I was like, well, I can develop one, but I'm not going to, because there's one that's highly reliable and valid and will give us good information that we can use. So I recommend that. In terms of setting aside resources for an evaluation, I think that's something that you need to negotiate with your funder, or just start including in your budget, and start talking about the importance of that. Like anything else, you have to put resources towards it if it's something that's of value to you. Now, when we look at the different types of evaluation activities that we can conduct, we typically think about them as process, impact, and outcome evaluation. And in process evaluation, what we want to measure is, were the intervention activities implemented as we planned? How many of those intervention activities were implemented, and who received those services? What does their ethnicity look like, their gender, their socioeconomic strata? Did we meet the needs when we implemented that program? Did we implement that program well? Did they get enough dose? Were they engaged? Were there any adaptations that we made to that program? Now, in impact evaluation, we want to be able to measure, did any change occur? So, for example, if we are doing some type of program where we want law enforcement officers to start interceding on opioid overdose, maybe we want them to give an injection of, the antigen, Noxolone, perhaps. We want to see, has there been a decrease in opioid overdose? Has there been an increase in deploying those tools that people may have? Are sheriff's deputies more likely to provide a dose of naloxone to somebody than they were the year before or before they went through the training? We may want to see if there's decreases in alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use among teenagers. Or if we're doing a parenting program, are parents more likely to talk to their kids about the dangers of drugs? Or are they more likely to monitor their kids' activities, associations, and whereabouts? Now, in outcome evaluation, what we want to be able to determine is, did the intervention or program affect the overall issue? Did we reach our goal? And by how much? Getting estimates of how much your program impacted the outcome is crucial. So you may know that it was your program that impacted the goal, but how much is a different story. And that's important to measure as well. Now, in process evaluation, again, we're talking about the process of how the program was being implemented. What went well, what went poorly? Is the intervention even needed by the priority population? How many services were delivered and who got those services? And then I think an important feature in process evaluation is measuring implementation fidelity. And one of the things we know about the importance of implementation fidelity is that the bridge between a promising approach, like an approach we think is really going to be effective, and whether or not it's effective is how well it's implemented. And that's what implementation fidelity is. It's simply how well a program is implemented. Now, what I will say is that programs are seldom implemented with 100% fidelity. I just finished evaluating a teen pregnancy prevention program, and there was about 30% fidelity to the program components. Usually we want to get up to about 85, 90% is usually a high level of fidelity. So the idea that programs are implemented with 100% fidelity, I think is romantic and nice to think about, but that simply doesn't happen, nor do I think that they need to be. Now, when we're collecting data on implementation fidelity, it can show us why our program is working and perhaps why our program is not working. So we might see, because we have poor implementation, that could be the reason why our program is not making an impact and getting to outcomes. So measuring program fidelity, implementation fidelity, as part of your process evaluation is very crucial in giving program staff information that they can use to improve their program. Now, there are 7 features that we commonly think about in terms of implementation fidelity. One of those features is dose or dosage, attendance, adherence, quality, adaptations, participant responsiveness. And so what is dose? Dose is how much of the intervention you offer. It's not necessarily what people get, but how much do you offer? So you might have a 10-lesson drug prevention program for elementary school students. So the dose would be 10 lessons. Or you may have 2-day training for law enforcement officers on reducing opioid overdose. Attendance is how many service delivery units did people take advantage of. So you may have an 11-lesson curriculum, but people only came to 9 of them. So attendance is who came and how often did they come? How much of the intervention or treatment did they get? Adherence refers to the extent to which the program components were implemented as they're supposed to be implemented. So were those program components implemented with quality? You know, when we deliver a program, it doesn't necessarily mean that we've delivered it with quality. You know, was the facilitator enthusiastic? Were they prepared? Did they look nervous? Did they look stressed? How did they interact with people? Adaptations are probably the most important feature of implementation fidelity. Adaptations can be deliberate or even accidental modifications of a program, like deleting or adding something to the program, modifying how the program is being implemented, changing the intensity or the way the program's implemented, modifying the program to meet some cultural or organizational goal. And so those adaptations are probably the thing that will affect the implementation fidelity the most. Now, some people ask, well, what types of adaptations are okay to do and what types of adaptations are less desirable? And I think a good way to think about it is this: fidelity to the program's theory, the model or the theory that the program is based upon, is most critical. I also think that dose is very, very critical, particularly implementing those programs that are what we call core components, the core things or activities in that program. Sometimes I've seen people will make changes to the program because of, you know, the culture or language or something like that. One time I had a program where they changed it so that they could get more participants to participate in the program. And in fact, they did get more people to participate in the program, but the things that they did, the adaptations that they made, they got more people to the program, but the program became ineffective. So more people were getting an ineffective program. And I would call that a negative side effect, right? So more people got a drug that simply didn't work. The other thing I would measure in implementation fidelity is the participant responsiveness. What do the participants look like when they're going through the program? Are they engaged? Are they entertained? Do they look like they're having an emotional reaction to what's happening? Or are they kind of just sitting there? I evaluated a drug court that they used to do in schools up in Northern California. And I went to go watch it happening in the school. So it's an actual drug court that occurred at a high school site. And I saw most of the kids sleeping. They were physically sleeping while the court session was going on. So you know they're not engaged. And what they witnessed in terms of another teenager being adjudicated for drug possession or drug use or something like that is not going to have an effect on their knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors because they were simply asleep. So measuring participant responsiveness, I think, is very important. Well, now that we talked about process evaluation, let's talk about impact and outcome evaluation. Now, in impact evaluation, we want to look at whether or not the goals or the objectives of the program were achieved. And are the trends moving in the right direction? Like, is there a decrease in the number of DUIs, or has there been a decrease in adolescent marijuana use? We also want to think about whether or not the program has beneficial effects, and what were those effects? Has the program addressed the issue and made it better? If so, how much better has there been? So if we have decreased marijuana use among teenagers, how much of a decrease has there been? And then I also think a very important question to ask in an impact and outcome evaluation is, was it the program that caused that change, or was it something else that's going on? So how do you find these program impacts? How do you know you've gotten to outcomes? Well, let's take a quick example. Let's say you want to determine if your program reduces the availability and use of drugs among youth. So you have all of these activities you're doing in your HIDA. Maybe you're bringing together a bunch of law enforcement agencies. Maybe you're sharing data. Maybe you are collaboratively working on drug interdiction. Maybe you're doing some type of media message to prevent drug use among kids. So what's happening here is you want to see whether or not what you're doing, your program, impacts both drug availability and then maybe a measure of the frequency of drug use among youth. So how often they use drugs, maybe in the last 30 days. So in this case, we would have an independent variable of the program, everything that the program does, law enforcement training, the investigation enforcement activities, the coordination, the billboards, the public service announcements, everything. And then what we want to measure perhaps is the perception of ease of access among youth. And then also how often they use drugs. Maybe we measure it in the last 3 months. So what we're looking for is program impact. Does our program impact ease of access or marijuana accessibility and marijuana use? I think the evaluation question is fairly simple. Does the program cause a change, hopefully a decrease, in the availability and the use of drugs in the community? So what we have here is we have our program, right? We planned that program, what we're doing, and we think it causes whatever we're seeing. And maybe we want to see a reduction in, let's say, marijuana availability, or we may want to see a reduction in the frequency of smoking marijuana. So that seems pretty straightforward, right? Our program is going to cause a change in adolescent drug use. But let's take a look at the program this way. So maybe we're doing that program. Maybe it's a youth drug court. So maybe we have kids that are coming and being adjudicated by their peers. Maybe there's an incentive that they do that. Maybe they're going to get a lighter sentence. But we have this drug court going on, and most of us are aware of what drug court means. And we think that kids that go through that drug court program, they're going to have a decrease in their drug use, right? So we think that our program, what we're doing, should cause a decrease in drug use. But this is what I would encourage you to think about. What other things could cause a decrease in adolescent drug use? Perhaps there's a city ordinance now that prohibits marijuana dispensaries. So the reason why there's been a decrease in drugs is not because the kid went through the drug court. It's just because there's fewer marijuana dispensaries in the community. Or maybe youth unemployment increases. So now kids don't have money to buy drugs. That could equally be an explanation. So maybe it's not the drug court, maybe it's not your program that's causing a decrease in drugs. Maybe it's just youth unemployment went up. Perhaps maybe there's less enforcement or there's more enforcement. Perhaps all the police officers in your area are going around and busting all types of drug houses and marijuana growth operations and kids that have drugs or kids that get caught smoking marijuana, because maybe it's that time of the year where they're going to get an employee evaluation and promotion and raises. So because they're more motivated to do their job, that was the thing that caused a decrease in drug use and not your youth drug court program. It could be that maybe there's a prevention program that's going on in your high school, and that's the program that's causing a decrease in drug use. It could be there's new employees at the probation office, and because there's new employees, drug use is going down. It could be simply the kids got older, and that's why they're using drugs less. We know from a developmental perspective that kids use drugs less because they simply get older. It could be that there's a parent training course. It could be that youth sports season starts. It could be that it's just rainy wintertime. It could be that they're just telling us what we want to hear when we survey it. It could be that a TikTok star dies of overdose. It could be a pandemic hits the USA. Or as my mentor said in graduate school, it could simply be the effect of the moon's gravitational force on the earth. The point that I'm trying to make is that there could be a number of things that could be affecting whether or not teens are reducing drugs. And really the only way to determine whether or not it's your program or something else is to come up with an evaluation design where you're comparing a group of people that get the intervention, X is the intervention, to a group of people that don't get the intervention, a comparison or control group. And then we could collect data before the program starts on both groups, do the program. Remember, only one group is getting the program. And then we could collect data afterwards. So we have baseline and follow-up data or pre-test and post-test data. And when we have that comparison group, we'll be able to control for all of those other alternative explanations. And you can see an example here of a study flow chart that I might do evaluating, let's say, a drug court program for youth. I might have, recruit 300 youth. Half of them are going to go through drug court. The other half are not. And I'm going to be looking at collecting baseline data, let's say, on their perceptions of availability and frequency of drug use. And then I'll do 2 follow-ups, maybe a 6-month follow-up and a 1-year follow-up. And what I want to see is drug use is going down for those who participated in the intervention, and it stayed the same or even got worse for the comparison group. Let's stop there and go ahead and take some questions, and then I'll make 1 or 2 comments to conclude for today.
Thank you, Dr. Lachos. And I just want to mention briefly to the group that evaluation design is important. And so we will develop what we're calling a prevention pearl to try to help flesh this out a little bit more, because I know you had additional material you wanted to share around that particular piece of evaluation. So we'll reach out and we will advertise that if you are subscribed to our ADAPT list. We actually have the Q&A it's on fire. So I'm going to start with some of the more collective themes, and then the additional questions are very specific. And so maybe we can follow a similar approach and address those via email specifically to the participants. So one of the questions that was asked was, in terms of thinking about your evaluation plan in general, how important is it to have a long-term data collection timeline versus just a short-term data collection timeline? Can you speak to that?
I think the participant is asking the question like, should you be collecting 3-month data follow-up, 6-month data follow-up, something like that?
Yes.
I mean, it all depends on the behavior. For middle school kids, we see drug use behavior is very episodic. They might smoke a cigarette in July and they may not smoke another cigarette until December. So it depends on the substance you're looking at. So if you're looking at marijuana use, we see teenagers, particularly older teenagers, use marijuana more frequently. Let's say they do methamphetamine or opioids or something like that. I think in general, you need to look at how your program's being implemented. And usually the standards are 6 months to a year. So when you look at evidence standards for effectiveness, it's typically minimum 6 months, at least a year. But a very fair question a policymaker could make is, well, you've demonstrated you have short-term impacts, but does this keep kids from using drugs 3 years after they went through your intervention?
All right, I'm going to combine 2 questions. We had one participant asking about, you had mentioned earlier on a collaborative evaluation tool. You would use that phrase. And then we also have people asking about, can you please share resources for finding these valid and reliable tools that you're suggesting?
Yeah, and I put together a number of resources for everything we've talked about today that ADAPT has graciously packaged for you all. There are a number of places that you can get that information. Now, just remember, some of these tools, they're commercially available, so you might have to pay for. Other ones, particularly if you find them just in the research literature, you can contact the researcher or the evaluator and they'll let you use them for free. So a great way to get free data collection tools is just to be reading journal articles or studies and seeing what other people are using, and then contacting that person and asking them if they'll give you a copy of it.
Okay. And this question I think is relevant for everyone, and it's super important. Can you speak to the need to collect demographic information for all of these evaluations? And if you had to choose just a few of those demographic variables, which ones would you choose?
Well, I think one of the issues we have in evaluation is every survey we do, we ask people what their gender, ethnicity, marital status is, race, those types of things. If you've got participants that are going through a program, you only need to ask them that once, because what I'm going to do is assign that participant a unique ID number. So I'm always going to know what their race is. I'm always going to know what their age is because I know their birth date. So I don't need to ask them that question every time. And I can put methods in place where I'm able to do that effectively. But I do think when you're asking demographic information, there's a difference between ethnicity and race. And I think that's an important distinction that people need to understand. I also think it's always better to measure demographic factors with measurement data than discrete data. So let me give you an example of that. You could ask somebody, are they, middle class, upper class, or lower class? That's just an example. What I think a better information to get is asking them something like, what is your household income last year? Because you get more information about that. So measuring it like on a ratio or interval scale is a lot better than measuring it using some type of discrete survey item.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze one more in because this comes up all the time. This particular participant is asking about the value of measuring attitudes in surveys. And we all know that knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, a lot of these are very common in evaluations. Can you speak specifically to measuring attitudes?
Well, I think what you should measure is you should measure those things that will answer your evaluation question. So if you have a logic model that says, well, if we change attitudes, that will change behavior. And if we change behavior, that will reduce the drug use rate. Then go ahead and measure attitudes as a hypothetical impact of your program. What I will say, though, is that the best predictor of morbidity and mortality is behavior. And I think a lot of evaluations don't measure behavior. So in some evaluations I do, I'll ask the staff, is changing people's attitudes, does that really matter to you? Or do you really want to change people's behavior? For example, I don't really care as a drug prevention researcher that kids have negative attitudes towards marijuana use. What I really want to do as a prevention scientist is either keep them from using marijuana or reduce the frequency of their marijuana use, regardless of what their attitudes are. And we know people that have negative attitudes towards smoking. We know people that have negative attitudes towards drug use, but they continue to use these drugs. So I think you need to be very specific about what your information needs are and the value of getting that information. And sometimes you just may not be appropriate to measure knowledge or attitudes or beliefs, because what you really want to do is measure behaviors.
Thank you. There are only 2 additional questions, and we'll respond to those individually via email. Patty?
And I'm very happy if people want to email me. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have, any way that I can be helpful to folks. Go ahead and shoot me an email, and I'd be more happy to answer your question.
Thank you, Dr. Lachos, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions, please email us at adapt@wb.hida.org. Once this webinar ends, just as a reminder, you will see a post-presentation survey that will pop up, and we'd really appreciate if you took a few minutes to provide your feedback. Once you complete that, you will automatically be emailed the certificate of participation for today's event. You can also expect a follow-up email within about 24 to 48 hours of a link to view a recording of today's webinar. Just want to let you all know that are still with us at this time that we hope you will save the date and join us again in a few weeks for a set of highly informative webinars on risk and protective factors in substance use prevention, where you'll be introduced to the factors that set someone up to be more or less likely to engage in substance use and how to address those through evidence-based preventive interventions. So registration email will come out next week for those events. But save the date for March 23rd and April 4th. So on behalf of the ADAPT team and presenters, thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.